And I remember headed to Iraq. I'm a major, so I'm mid-career, and I'm going to be the senior intelligence analyst for Al Anbar for the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, and certainly for the 1st Marine Division, who is the primary ground combat element. And I thought we had a plan. When we got there, I just like my great uncles had served, there was a plan for occupation, and we were going to stabilize that defeated area, and we were going to set it back up for a responsible government that would not be a threat to us. And when I got to Iraq, I found out that it couldn't be further from the truth. We were in a slugfest with jihadis coming from everywhere. We didn't believe they were coming from everywhere. We refused to believe as a country. The intelligence community refused to believe that it was an internationalized jihadi framework. We wanted to believe that it was regime holdouts, which certainly there were a lot of them. But we were fighting every day people we didn't understand, and we had no plan. And we were losing Marines left and right. And we would capture bomb makers. I remember, and put them in Abu Ghraib prison, which became obviously a disaster for us morally later because of the abuses that happened in Abu Ghraib. But the terrorists were holding bomb-making classes in Abu Ghraib that were making them more lethal while they were inside and after they got out than they had been before. And so we were facing this growing resistance that we didn't understand, and frankly, we refused to understand. And that's when I realized we're losing people to no effect. And where is this going to end? And of course, we see now in hindsight, well, we had no plan, and we didn't know where it was going to end because the war we wanted was not the war we got. We never asked the question about the enemy's will to fight. Let me back up for a second. The definition of war is the violent clash between two irreconcilable wills. That's a classic definition of warfare. And so you ask yourself about your enemy whether you can defeat their capabilities or defeat their intentions. And we never asked the question whether we could actually defeat our enemy's will to fight. Could we ever really break their will to fight? You know, if you recall William Tecumseh Sherman during the American Civil War, you know, he knew the South because he had lived in the South before the Civil War. And he said to the North, he said, we must show them the hard hand of war. And so it became the goal of the Union to break the Confederate will to fight. And they did that, and we have a Union today because that will was broken. We did not know what the will of the enemy was. We didn't even know where it was. We disagreed on what the locus of that will was. And so therefore we had no plan to break it. And we certainly couldn't remove all the capabilities that they had. At that time, there were fields full of munitions laying around that the Iraqis had, and we couldn't control them all. So we had unlimited capability and unknown will. That's a recipe for defeat.
Which is stupefying when you think about coming out of Vietnam, where that was the exact problem. I mean, Ho Chi Minh's famous saying, "We will wear them down like water over the stone," is wearing down the Americans' will to fight, right? And you'd think this would be burned into the American psyche.
No, the American psyche is actually we have a very short horizon because we're a young country. And people read our books and they believe what we say because we believe what we say generally. And so they read us and they understand us, but we refuse to believe them and who they say they are because we want to believe that, sadly, I think we want to believe there's a Jeffersonian democratic heart beating in the chest of every human. And I just don't know that that's the case necessarily. So we were denying reality, and we wound up meeting reality in a very hard way, both in Iraq, now that we see the Shia takeover of Iraq, I believe, and then in Afghanistan after our shameful retreat a few years ago, and the whole thing collapses. So that's what's happening to me, and now I'm beginning to wonder, we may have gone to war for the right reason, so jus ad bellum, to use the classical just war theory, just war tradition term, jus ad bellum. Going to war is your reason for going to war just? Yes, but jus in bello, your law in war, your behavior in war, is that just? You have to ask the question: is prolonging a conflict, is that just at some point? And if you can't win it, then what do? Well, you have to negotiate your way out. And we could argue whether or not what we negotiated for is what we actually wanted. Had we had this to do over again, I think we might have arrived at different policy conclusions. So that's one level. On the other level, I'm watching all the casualties, and I'm watching what is happening to Marines in the formation, and frankly, as I moved into special operations, to soldiers, sailors, airmen who are fighting. And what's interesting is you note over time a change, and like many cultures that don't write down a whole lot, you see it in symbology. And in the military, we have these things called challenge coins, and then we have plaques and paddles that we give away as tokens of fellowship when someone leaves the unit. And what you watch through all the symbology that's encoded in those challenge coins or in those plaques and paddles, you see the symbols change over the course of the war. In the early days of the war, it was the Punisher. It was the comic book character, the Punisher. We are going to go and we're going to punish those guys for what they did to us on 9/11. And certainly we went and did our share of punishing and attempts to punish them. But as we began to take casualties, well, now you started to see the Spartan symbology show up, Spartan helmets and the Lacedaemonian shields with the lambda, the Greek letter lambda for the Spartans show up on things, and the gifts became helmets and helmets on shirts, and because that movie, the 300 came out, and it was, the famous Spartan saying, the Persians, when they fire a volley of arrows, it darkens out the sun. He goes, well, we'll fight in the dark, or we'll fight in the shade. And so this became a symbol of us taking casualties, but we're a resilient force, and we're going to stick to it, and we're going to fight this out. But then the next phase of the war, when people began to question, okay, I've been on my third or fourth combat deployment. I had one sailor, corpsman in my unit who'd been on 6 combat deployments in 8 years. And you lose so many friends, you've seen so much trauma, you've seen so much bloodshed and killing by this point. You begin to ask, what's it all about? Is there an end to this thing? And is there an end to it for me where I don't widow my wife and orphan my children? How many more friends am I going to lose? And then those friends that I did lose, how do I morally reconcile this in my world? Right. And so the comic book character changed finally to Thor. You start to see Odinist symbology. You start to see crows and Thor's hammer, and what you were seeing there wasn't an adoption necessarily of this neo-pagan religion, but rather it was this concept of and you see Valhalla invoked. Yeah. Whenever we would lose a Marine, you would say, till Valhalla. I'd go to these funerals, and they would have raise a glass to him afterwards and say, till Valhalla. And you're wondering where all this is coming from, and then you realize, well, in the Odinist framework, Valhalla is a place where warriors, regardless of who their affiliation is with, when they get to Valhalla, because they were a valorous warrior, a valiant warrior, just their fighting itself was meritorious. That's how you gain Valhalla. And so there's some place where this is all reconciled for the warrior, and maybe that Taliban guy that I fought, he was pretty valiant too. I mean, that guy fought in flip-flops his whole life with an AK-47, and here I have the most advanced weaponry on the earth, and yet we're still duking it out 20 years later. That framework began to emerge as men began to ask themselves, was this all worth it? And so you see the moral trauma of this warfare begin to take its toll in the American fighting force. Didn't mean that they weren't refusing to go. They were still signing up to go, and they would go because it was their duty. But the reasons why they went and the impacts on them when they went were beginning to show.
Yeah, and so I think you're outlining, especially because I did a lot of rotations down in South America doing the same thing, and so you get to see it over time, and you do have these kind of existential questions like, wait, are we changing anything? In that case, our enemy was drug cartels and trying to get cocaine off the streets, and the amount of cocaine we stopped from leaving Colombia was grotesque. Like the cocaine that just never even got out of the borders of Colombia because we were able to shoot it down or burn it or stop it in some way. And yet, the addiction on the street didn't really change that much in America or Europe. And I think, one of the things when young men and women ask me, like, oh, you were in the military, what should I do if I want to join the military? And I think one of my first hesitations, I'm just interested to see what your version of this is or how you would react, is the military can be great. I know lots of people that had a great experience, and mainly who didn't serve in combat. But they used the opportunities, they got an education, it worked out great for them. But they could have gotten assigned to some role that ended up in a really bad situation. And I think when I talk to young Christians, I think in their minds they think, well, yeah, but if that were me and I had this really bad situation, I would choose to do the right thing, even if that meant nobly jumping on a grenade or dying or whatever. They have all these romantic ideas about combat, which why wouldn't they? It's been burned in them since they were a child from movies and fiction and stories. But then, and I don't know how to explain to him, to, the average 18-year-old. No, I'm talking about you're in a situation and there are four bad options, and you're not actually sure which one is worse than the other, but you're going to have to go down one of those roads. Like it's a bad fork, and you're going down the road ignorantly. And I say I just don't know how to prepare people for that situation. And I wish that, as you kind of said to me before, that's when you want righteous and noble people and wise people to be in those situations. But it's not going to stop the scarring that happens from being in those situations. So yeah, I guess what's your reaction to that? How would you correct me?
Well, I don't think you need correction at all. I would add one layer to it. I mean, first of all, the American military culture, particularly for the enlisted ranks, is frequently a very morally challenging culture, particularly in the area of sexual ethics. And Christian view of sexuality is frequently in opposition to the reigning cultural norms inside those ranks. And so you have to ask yourself, first of all, am I the type of person who I know who I am as a Christian? I know what Christ calls me to, the love, the type of holiness he calls me to, and I'm willing to pursue that in the face of a culture that is debauched frequently. And and by the way, this isn't anything new. So I mean, I'm not
Right.
picking on this generation. I
Yeah,
mean,
I started in the '90s, and it was definitely debauched before the internet came
I
around.
grew up under officers who I grew up under officers who served as the only two Christian officers in a Marine Corps flying squadron, and they were ostracized their whole deployment because they chose to do things that were out of step with the rest of the officers in that squadron during their deployment to the Pacific. And and when I was complaining about a moral decision I had to make when I was a lieutenant, they were majors, and they were like, it was a very small thing that I was confronted with compared to 6 months of ostracism by your peers.
Right.
So, are you that type of Christian who's willing to take that on and then be faithful in that environment on a daily basis? So that's the first thing. If you think teens are at risk in an internet-fueled, porn-soaked pop culture generally, then add to that a paycheck that gives a young person more money than they've ever had before, a new car, and unlimited access to alcohol, substances, and venues that promote all kinds of unfaithful behavior, and that's what you're going to face. So that's the first layer. Then have you considered the calling that you, like you said, you may be called? You should assume, because it's the military itself, that if you join particular MOSs like the infantry, the artillery, intelligence, and other places that are going to put you in the combat zone, and in the Marine Corps, every Marine's a rifleman, we say, and plenty of logistics and supply Marines and aviation mechanics have been in gunfights, you're going to have to apply violence to a situation on behalf of a government. In this case, you're going to apply violence on behalf of the United States in support of its national interests. And are you willing to do that? And have you thought through that? And you need to be sure and resolute in your decision to do that, because that may happen. Otherwise, you're gambling, right? I mean, you're really gambling. And I don't know if gambling is necessarily a Christian virtue. And so I think you need to think about those things. And then when you thought about that, I've talked a lot about the trauma that ensues from those types of events in combat. Now, one of the reasons why I think Americans have suffered post-traumatic stress in the military the way they have is because we have frequently, not always, but leaders have frequently failed to give a moral framework for the combat or the conflicts we're in. And those righteous causes have been available, but they've not always been addressed, or they've not always been addressed sufficiently before the conflict, during the conflict, and afterwards, in order to alleviate some of the moral trauma we see. And so I think for a young Christian going into, particularly in these fraught days when there are plenty of opportunities for conflict, you need to think through that. It doesn't mean you shouldn't join. Once again, we're providing principles for how to think about it. So those are kind of on thinking about going into the service, that would be kind of the layers of the problem that or the layers of questions I would put to a young person considering military service.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I had a few points in my service where I had just an eye-opening experience, and one of them was when officers would kind of take off their rings when you go on deployment. with every intention of doing everything, and they're the leaders, right? And so the signal is very clear, that this is now fair game to do these kinds of things.
And you're going to pay for
Oh yeah.
opposing that culture. There is a price to pay.
And like everything, especially in the officer corps, everything is political, right? So I mean, military might be one of the more fair organizations at some levels, but everything works in some kind of political spectrum. What your peers think of you matters for your career.
Well, it's a self-selecting organization. The leaders select the next generation that comes up behind them, and so that selection process is very much based on, first of all, I think professional capability, but there is a sense in like how loyal are you to the service and to the institution itself, and I don't think they necessarily combine their personal moral values to the institution, but certainly that impacts how you're perceived as a loyal member of the team.